Welcome to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. The only podcast where it's okay to talk in band. On this podcast, you will be able to hear conversations with some of the greatest names in wind band conducting, composing, and arranging. We'll also visit with great college, high school, middle school, and elementary band directors to get their thoughts on various aspects of being a band director. We'll have regular check-ins with instrument specialists, music dealers, and instrument repair professionals. And if that's not enough, we'll even have regular conversations with Dr. Tim, who will help keep us motivated. That's Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. And now, here's Charlie.
Welcome to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. Today is our 15th podcast since our first one back on March 10 of 2020. It's hard to believe that over 3 months has passed since I began this project. And in looking back, all I can say is that it has sure been a lot of fun connecting with some old friends and providing you, the listeners, a front row seat on some very special conversations. Today, I'm pleased to give you 2 more great conversations to get you thinking. We begin with Glen Schneider, who is on the wind and percussion faculty at Metea Valley High School in the Indian Prairie School District 204 in suburban Chicago, Illinois. Glen has a great story to tell, growing up as the son of 2 music teachers, and he shares with us his thoughts about the important role band directors have to inspire their students to learn. Our second conversation today is with Scott Teeple. Scott serves as professor of music, director of bands, and chair of the conducting area at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Scott grew up in a family music store business, and I'm convinced the people skills he learned along with his music is one of the real keys to his success. You're going to hear some profound words that all of us need to hear when we stand on the podium and look out at our students. The theme for today's podcast is being a role model and the influence that we have on our students. We simply do not know the impact that our presence has in the students' lives. Give a good listen today. I think you're going to get a lot out of it. That's Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. We'll be right back.
Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends is made possible through the support of Hal Leonard, Eastman Musical Instruments, and Vandercook College of Music.
Joining us on Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends is a young man that I had the pleasure of meeting many years ago. I had the opportunity to do a visiting lecture, I guess you'd call it, at Duquesne University for Tim Lotzenheiser. Is there anybody else? I mean, we all meet everybody through Tim Lotzenheiser in this world. And this young man was a member of his class, and I was very impressed with him. And I got back home to Chicago, and about 2 days later, I got this really nice thank you note from him for being in the class, and it really stuck with me. And then several years later, lo and behold, this guy transplants himself from Pennsylvania to Oswego, Illinois. He's none other than Glen Schneider. Glen, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure.
It's great to virtually see you, even though our listeners won't be able to see you here. And we served together on the Music Achievement Council, Educational Board, and you've taught for some classes at Vandercook. I mean, you're just doing everything. So, but how long have you been teaching in Illinois since you graduated from Duquesne?
I've taught in Illinois for 18 years, and I taught 1 year out of college for I taught out of college for 1 year, so total of 19 years.
So you taught 1 year in Pennsylvania?
Yes.
And where was that?
I taught general music. I taught general music K through 3 in Fox Chapel, Illinois, Fox Chapel, Pennsylvania, and that was my first job out of college. I also wound up teaching some band lessons that year in addition to teaching general music. So that was my first job.
So where'd you go to high school and where'd you grow up? Where in Pennsylvania?
Well, I actually did not grow up in Pennsylvania. I grew up in New Jersey, right outside of New York City, right over the George Washington Bridge. There's a town called Tenafly, New Jersey, and my dad was a band director at Tenafly Middle School and High School. And he had grown up in the New Jersey area. He was a gigging musician, and Tenafly was a really good high school. And so my parents wanted me to go to high school at Tenafly. So we lived in a different town, but they had me attend Tenafly. And Tenafly was a really neat high school to attend because they had a lot of musical offerings, probably more so than a typical high school. For instance, I had band. I could play in an orchestra. I sang in the choir throughout my whole high school, career. But then I was also in a barbershop quartet for a few years. I was in a jazz combo. I took music theory. Our high school even had solfege as a class. So I took a whole year of solfege. We had music theory. We had my band director there taught music technology. So we had this whole comprehensive music curriculum that was pretty unique back then.
So in looking back to those elementary, middle, and high school days, was it really different from the kind of experience that kids are getting today?
Well, not really. In a lot of respects, we are continuing to do what we've always done, which is we try to have traditional ensembles and try to be as creative as we can with those. But, we're also trying to uphold the traditions of those ensembles by playing traditional repertoire and teaching students how to go from, more simple music into more complicated things. And, in a lot of ways, it probably isn't much different. I just look back on it and I think how appreciative I am of my high school teachers and my middle school teachers. My dad was my middle school band director, for instance. They were doing things for us in our community that they thought were great. And they had an amazing music program. So I'm just really appreciative of what I got to experience as a high schooler.
So you grew up in a household where your dad was the middle school band director, and your early days in band, when was that light bulb moment that you said, man, I'm going to do this for a profession?
Oh, man. I think I always wanted to be a music teacher. My mom was also a music teacher. They were always giving lessons out of our house. My mom and dad were very involved with NJMEA. My brother and sister became musicians as well. Basically, music is what we did. And as I got a little closer to graduating from high school, we started having those conversations around the dinner table of, hey, what are you going to major in college? And I'll never forget the conversation I had with my parents when they said, all right, so what are you going to major in college? And I said, I want to do music education. I want to do what you guys do. And my dad, I'll never forget this. He looked right at me and said, have you not been looking at what we do for the last however many years? Like, why would you go into this profession? You know what we have to go through, and why don't you get a real job and make some real money? He was kind of joking, of course. But I said, of course I want to do what you guys do. This is all I've ever known. So it really has been kind of the family business, if you will say. And it's kind of neat because you look at your teaching style and you hear what you say to your students on the podium, and you see how you handle certain situations. There's a lot of things that I learned from my mom and dad living in that house that I still handle the way that they would have handled things. So really brought me up in a music education house. Yeah.
Yep. That's wonderful, man. That's great experience. And of course, you heard a lot of dinner table, I'm sure, or dinner table talk that probably influenced you too. So you get this job as Margene Pappas's assistant at Oswego, and she retires, and then you become the director of bands at Oswego, and you held that position for several years. And then you took a job at Metea Valley. So what was the motivation to go from Oswego to Metea?
Well, that was a really tough choice. I remember having days where I felt like maybe I shouldn't move jobs. And then I had days where I thought, this sounds really exciting, but am I doing this for the right reasons? I have a lot of colleagues now in District 204, where Metea Valley is, that I had known through the years. Like, for instance, one of the guys at Neuqua Valley High School, Jonathan Loff, he and I met years ago when we were both counselors at Interlochen. So we had a friendship for a summer there. And when I moved out to Illinois, I saw that he was out here, and we always stayed in touch. And as you're teaching in a particular area, you meet the area directors, and you start to hear what people are doing in one district and hear what people are doing over here. And it was a tough decision to leave Oswego because we had just marched in the Tournament of Roses parade. We were about to do a clinic performance at the Midwest Clinic. I mean, we had all these great things lined up. And still, for some reason, I was really feeling called to look into this new job at this brand new high school. And I remember a couple of people came to me and said, "Hey, you should look into this. This would be a really neat thing to have you on board." And I didn't really know how exciting it could be to open a new school. But looking back 12 years, I think, man, we have accomplished so much, and we got to build all these new ideas and new traditions and at a school. And so that became really the reason to leave. Was this is truly a once in a lifetime opportunity to build a music program from the ground up. But I'll never forget the day where I had to tell my students in Oswego that I was going to move on to another job. They didn't understand why. They didn't know what was going on. Personally, you look at things like the pay scale, and you look at the schedule, and you look at what you get to teach, and things weren't all that different from job to job. The big thing that District 204 had at that time that Oswego maybe didn't was they had an orchestra program and just a little more of a comprehensive music program. And I guess at that point in my career, I just really wanted to be involved with that program, and it was the right choice. I'll never regret that move. But to anybody that goes through a job switch, man, it's heart wrenching. It's really difficult. So in the end, though, it's a job, and we have to do the best we can with the students that are in front of us. And that's what I would say is the most interesting thing is, you leave one job and go to somewhere else, and the minute you get in front of that new group, you're still teaching with passion. You're still in a community of learners, and again, hard to leave, but so exciting to move on. So, that was a really, really interesting part of my career, I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Glenn, I've had the pleasure of visiting you when you were at Oswego and Metea, and I've watched you work and had an opportunity to work your ensembles. So how would you say your teaching has changed over the years since you first started as Margine's assistant at Oswego?
Well, teaching with Margine and the other teachers at Oswego, Rachel Maxwell, Dan Harrison, all the folks that I started out with in Oswego, they had this whole system down. I was so impressed when I came to Oswego. They had such a big, 10,000 foot view of how they wanted to teach things, and from rhythm to band sound and all that stuff. They had borrowed a lot of ideas, but also really come up with a unique way of teaching in and of itself. And so I learned from them. I conducted the way they did, and I programmed the way they programmed, and I took a lot of advice from them. And then you go back, and I got my master's degree at Vandercook. That's where we really connected, you and I, and with other professors at Vandercook. You start to meet other people and really start to challenge yourself about why you do things, how you do things, what's the best way to do things. And that's when you start to figure out your own ways of doing things, right? Because you just have experience. You figure out from trial and error what works. So the big change for me is I feel like I've gone from a band instructor to more of a music teacher. That's been my kind of evolution. Is you start out having to figure out all your transpositions and how to teach all the instruments, and that's an important part of teaching band. But then as you get older, that stuff starts to become so natural for you. You look at a score and you don't have to transpose anymore because it just happens automatically. You don't have to worry about how to get your clarinets to sound good because you have 15 or 20 ways to get them to sound good, right? So then, because that all becomes so automatic and so natural, now you start to really get into why this piece is being played and what's the heart of the piece and how can we make it more emotional. And so just like any other teacher, I think I've evolved a lot into my own, but I still have all those foundational things that I learned from my mentors. They're still right there. So could not have become, who I am today without those first teachers showing me how to do everything.
So any lessons that you've taken from your time with Margine? I mean, she's such a master teacher. Anything that's really sticks with you?
Well, Margine is so awesome. And I think the first thing that comes to my mind is that she's just really humble. She'll say to this day that I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just trying this and doing this. And I have my ideas about this and I borrow this idea from this guy. And yet everyone goes, Margine, you got it all figured out. And really, behind the walls, when you have a conversation with her, she's just like everybody else. She's trying to figure out how to do it the best still after all these years. But I will say that the one thing that stays with me that I learned from her is that when you get up on that podium, your job is to make musical decisions. That you got to phrase a melody and you got to tell the students, where we're going to put the emphasis on a particular note or phrase. You got to have an idea of where the rhythm goes. You got to have the articulation figured out before you get up there. And if you have an idea of what you want that piece to sound like, you get up there, you can make a lot of progress and help the ensemble get better. So I always would see her stop the group and say, all right, here's what we're going to do. And the minute she started in with the rehearsal, she knew exactly what she was going to do. So that's kind of what I liked about her teaching. And I think that's really stayed with me.
So when that high school band director steps on the podium, they got to bring high musical standards. They have to lead their kids. Anything else they need to bring? Any other responsibilities that they have?
Well, I mean, besides being a person that you would want to follow, in other words, like being a great example and a leader, I feel like my job now is to inspire students to learn. What I mean by that is somebody can always learn something from a musical experience, whether it's how they're playing with somebody else or how they're playing the notes and rhythms, or how they are approaching their instrument, how they're approaching the audience. I think even the best musicians can be challenged with, how and why are you doing this? So when I teach, college ensemble, I still come to them with, hey, what do you want to get better at? And why are you playing this piece? Like, why are you playing it that way? Down to a 9th grade student that has only played for a few years. Why are you playing this? Why are we doing this? And I think if musicians really have a reason for performing, it brings it to that next level. Then they want to practice. They want to learn the technique. They want to take lessons because now it's about why. So I think when I get on the podium, it's a heavy responsibility to figure out how to do that. But if you can study your scores and you can really think about what you're doing up there, I think your job is to inspire people.
Yeah. Metea, I think really, from my observation, has a really diverse student body.
They do.
And most of those students, although they may continue in music in some form, play in a college band or something like that, most of them are not going to be music majors when they leave your program. So what do you want them to leave with once they graduate?
Yeah, this is really central, I think, to everyone teaching now. Is we're all trying to have conversations about what does music do for you and why should you study it, right? So for instance, you're going to become a biologist, or you're going to go into finance or something like that. Why would you ever want to be in music then? I think of my own brother. My twin brother is a really successful banker with Fifth Third Bank. He's up, he's like at the executive level, but he has an undergraduate degree in euphonium performance from Michigan, and he has told me over and over again that the things that he learned in music, the way he approached practicing and perfecting his juries and auditions and things, those are just as vital to learning the ins and outs of finance. And really, I mean, he's a great example, among others, that musicians have this ability to get down to the most fine details in your work to get the quality done. And I think, whatever job you go into, people want you to do a quality job, right? They want to see a great product. So I think musicians need to communicate that. And so I think before a student graduates from Metea Valley, we want them to practice saying that and practice writing that out. So part of what we do on all our semester exams, on all of our reflections, we constantly reintroduce that question of, why do you do this? And we feel that as they go through high school, they should just keep on refining and re-articulating why they study music. And man, they say some amazing stuff when they finish up from a high school degree. And the coolest part is when they come back 10 years later and they say, Mr. Schneider, I never really knew what music was doing for me, but now that I work for this trucking company, or now I work for this, now I can see how important teamwork is. Because man, getting my team in my business, it's so hard to get together. But we were doing it in high school band. Our district a couple of years ago went through some cuts and some issues where we had to kind of refight for our music program in some ways. And what it comes down to is, does your community value music? And I think the answer is, of course they do. Everyone loves music. Everyone thinks music is important. But try to get those community members that own businesses or have other professions than music to come in and say, here's why I think music is important. Because as a doctor, my music education was central to what I do now. So we've been trying to, we're still working at it, but we've been trying to get that to be a big part of their music education at Metea.
Since I met you and you studied at Vandercook and we had a chance to work together, I've always realized, I think you're one of the best and brightest young people I've met in the profession. I don't mean to blow smoke up your fanny, but I believe that. You're a great thinker and you always have great ideas to share. So if you could implement one new idea in band education, what would it be?
Well, it's a really big idea, I would say, and this is not targeting people that are really into band, but what I would like to say to the band community is that we have to keep on remembering that we're musicians. All of us are artists, and it's really easy to get so into band that we forget about the rest of the music world. We forget about the orchestral and the choral world. We forget about new compositions. We forget about the innovative part of what's really happening in the music world. So I think we just need to be careful that we still stay connected to what is considered real or new music out there in the community, out there in the music world, and not close our doors off to things. So I would say to the band people out there that we are music teachers. Our responsibility is to introduce ideas and give students experiences in music, not in band. Band is our vehicle. Band's our car to get there, right? But when you start thinking that way, and when you start talking about yourself as a music educator, you just think differently. You emphasize different things in your rehearsal. And along with all the techniques and the warm-ups and all the stuff we have to do as band teachers, we also have to remember that music is the central focus. I think that could really bring our profession a long way.
Uh-huh. What's one common mistake you think directors make? And if you think if they could correct it, it would have an immediate impact on their teaching?
Yeah, I guess along those lines, I think some teachers think that there's a magic pill, like here's the book I have to have my kids playing out of, or here's the warm up that will get my kids to play in perfect intonation, right? And while I think you have to have the best resources available and be out there on the look for those things, I think that if you ask your students to make music and you make those musical decisions on the podium, I think the technique and the tuning and all those things, it all seems to always work itself out. Uh, for instance, if a student can't play something really fast, that all the technique builders in the world are not going to necessarily get them there. It's the combination of that and the saying, hey, let's put a little accent on this third 16th note, and that accent on that third 16th note might get those fingers to fly differently or think differently about that lick than you would have before. So I would say to all those directors out there, bring your instrument to the podium. Make sure you can play all the music, and then get up there and just be the example. Play that thing. If you're a trumpet player, play the clarinet part on your trumpet. If you're a percussionist like myself, go to the xylophone and play the flute part. And I think just the fact that you're playing their part, again, inspires them to want to sound that way. The techniques, a lot of the time, take care of themselves. So that's my recommendation to young directors is have your horn out on your podium, next to your podium, be able to play for your students all the time, because I think that music communicates a lot better than words.
That's great advice. So in addition to your teaching at Metea, I know you teach online classes for Vandercook, and you've also served as the conductor for the Wheaton College Symphonic Band. And then you also have a wife and 5 children. So how does Glen Schneider balance that all?
That's a great question. I'm not even sure that I balance it very well. But people have asked me that question before, and I think the way that the way I'm wired, the way that I think about my jobs and my family is, I'm pretty good at like going into something and giving it my all. If I'm gonna have a rehearsal at Wheaton College for an hour and a half, I'm going to be into that rehearsal. I'm going to prepare for that rehearsal, and then you got to move on, and then it's time to go home and cook dinner for my kids and my wife. And then it's time to go to the store and get a light bulb for that light bulb in the basement that burned out. And then it's time to get up early and work out. And then it's time to, so I sort of have to segment my life so that I plan, I schedule it all. And then when I'm doing that one thing, I'm into that one thing. And I think I've learned that you got to do what you can do and then move on. You can't, for me at this point in my career, I can't sit at my computer and plan for 8 hours. I used to be able to do that as a younger student or a younger person before kids and my multiple jobs. But so when it comes time, when I know I have to schedule, 45 minutes for a meeting coming up, I got to get everything done in that 45 minutes. And so I've just become a little better at focusing and it's not wandering so much. So my recommendation for people who are trying to balance it all is schedule yourself, put it on your phone, make lists, and then go through your day and do what you can and then move on. And then the next day is a new day. So, yeah.
Yep. Plan your work and work your plan, right?
Exactly. I mean, you're a master of doing all kinds of things too. I mean, don't you think that people sometimes get too obsessed with sitting in front of something for too long? Like sometimes you just have to go at it and then give it a rest.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You got to make lists, man. You got to plan what you're going to do. Absolutely.
Exactly.
So Glen, you got 19 years of experience under your belt. So you're looking in the mirror and there's that 18-year-old Glen Schneider. What kind of advice would you give him?
Practice more paradiddles. Oh man, I do. I wish I could go back and do it all over again. I wish all the times that I wasn't practicing my drums, I could go back and get all that practice time back. All that stuff. I wish I could do this. I wish I could do that. But I don't know. The advice I would give to an 18-year-old who's going into music is remember to enjoy it. Remember to use your mentors. I think that's one of the biggest things, is to enjoy your time and work your connections. And you are placed into this world, and you are among people in your community, in your line of work, for a reason. And you have to be able to see that the older folks that you're teaching with, the younger folks, the professors you have in school, they're there for a reason. That you're in that situation, and don't burn any bridges. Use everybody to help you become who you want to be. I see a lot of younger people trying to disagree and trying to come up with arguments for why this person doesn't have this sort of thing together. Do more listening, do more observing. And I think if you can learn from the folks that are ahead of you, they will carve that path out for you. So, but enjoy the process for sure.
And that's one thing I've always admired about you. You always have a good, positive attitude, and you enjoy your time, and you don't get caught up with that negative energy. That your positive attitude is contagious. So keep up the good work, buddy. I'm proud of you. I'm proud to know you, and thanks for joining the podcast, man.
Well, thanks for everything you've done. Speaking of a positive person, I've always appreciated what you say on the podium, and as a mentor and a friend and everything, you always are trying to move forward. And I think that's really inspiring to me, is, hey man, I might be doing this now, but I'm going to do this now, and it's going to be awesome. And I think that word comes out of your mouth a lot. This is going to be awesome. We're going to have a great time. So thanks for doing what you're doing with this podcast. This is cool that people get to know other people through this, and feel like you get to sort of just hang out with somebody that's across the country or across the world. I really think it's a neat project.
Thanks a lot, Glenn. God bless you.
All right. Take care.
Glen Schneider is a really bright young man and an excellent thinker. I loved his comment about us remembering that we are musicians, that we are artists. And the idea to have students re-articulate why they study music every semester and every year is an incredible exercise, and one you may want to add to your toolbox this coming year. Coming up, a really wonderful conversation with Scott Teeple of the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
Vandercook College Music is proud to support Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and friends. Vandercook is the only college in the nation solely devoted to the practical education of the school music teacher. If you have a student who wants to teach music, or if you or someone you know is looking for a great, practical Master of Music education program, then look no further than Vandercook College of Music in Chicago, Illinois. Vandercook also has the largest array of on-campus and online classes in their Metea continuing education program. To learn more about Vandercook, visit vandercook.edu.
So joining us on the podcast is one of the good guys in the profession, one of the guys that wears a white hat. He is professor of music, director of bands, and chairman of the conducting area at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Probably coming to us from the middle of Camp Randall Stadium right now. Football's not in session yet in Wisconsin, is it? Please welcome Scott Teeple. Scott, how are you this morning?
I'm doing great, Charlie, and I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, thank you so much, and thanks for taking time to have a little chat. Scott, you're a Michigan boy, and I know your mom and dad. And was your dad running the music store when you were a young man?
Oh, yeah. He was running the music store before I was born. My parents had a music store in Southfield, which is just outside of Detroit, and that's where I was born. It was in a strip mall, and the strip mall had a fire and the whole thing burned down. So they moved back to their hometown of Port Huron. And I was born in Southfield, and a year into my life, they moved to Port Huron and started the music store all over again from scratch.
So talk to me about growing up in a household where dad ran a music store.
Well, it was pretty exciting. Just for the record, it was mom and dad. And I think they both ran the store so well, I think because she was probably the right brain or the left brain of the enterprise, and he was the right brain. He was front of house and she was behind the scenes, making sure all the I's were dotted and T's were crossed. But it was just life. It wasn't just relegated to talk around the dinner table, or it was just life. I remember being a little kid and being excited to go on the road with my dad. And because my dad was, using that analogy, front of house, he loved being in band rooms and connecting with directors. He loved to see the kids make their first sounds. He and the staff of the store would help directors do fittings, and they would do rental programs. And I can remember the fall just being, the schedule was chock full of rental programs around the southeastern part of the state. So it was exciting. It was life 24/7, but I loved it.
Yeah, and it was normal. We have a similar story, except I grew up in a candy business. My dad was a candy wholesaler. And so I was there, and that was what life was. It was the candy business. I thought every kid had the same kind of experience that I did. It was just the way it is. So, yeah.
People in our profession, regardless of what you're teaching, I think when you're teaching, it consumes your life. It's not an 8 to 5 or 8 to 3 kind of job. And musicians are like any other kind of creative lot, artists or actors. They're always thinking about it and trying to come up with new ways or trying to become better. And music was just always a topic, whether it was at church or whether it was at a rental program or anywhere.
So how old were you when you picked up your first instrument, and what was it? And I say not picked it up, I mean picked it up to play it,
Well, you mean seriously, or when I made my first sound?
Okay. Either one.
When I was a little, my grandfather was a member of the Salvation Army. And he played baritone horn in the Salvation Army band in Port Huron, Michigan. And there was something about the sound of that Salvation Army band as a little kid that would stir me. And I can remember being a little kid at a Sunday night service one time, and my eyes started to water because that music was so beautiful. But they would have their Sunday evening services in the park, and I apparently would run down the hill when the band played and start waving my arms and just want to be down where the band was. And my grandmother would have to go down and pick me up and bring me back up to the hillside where they were sitting on a blanket. But as a little kid, I would love to go to church on Sunday nights with my grandfather to hear the band. Everything else, was superfluous, but I longed for that brass band sound.
So how old were you when you first started playing?
So he let me play his baritone horn just to make some sounds. But I started on piano. I must have been in kindergarten or first grade when I started taking piano lessons. I took that all through school, and that was always the stipulation. You can do anything else, but you have to keep the piano up. And I wanted more than anything to be able to play piano. And when I started sixth grade band, I started on saxophone until my middle school band director towards the end of the year said, we really need a tuba player. And he knew because of my piano skills, I could read bass clef. So it was really learning the fingerings. So I took some private lessons from a retired band director in Port Huron named Jake Wade, who was a legend. And I played tuba on the spring concert, and then I just stuck with it throughout high school and college.
Any fond memories from that high school days?
Oh, so many. I had a great band director in Bob Clark, and Mr. Clark made sure that I had access or awareness of opportunities that might be available to me, whether it was through solo and ensemble or band festival or the Michigan Youth Arts Festival or Interlochen. But it was, he was a really terrific teacher and had a very large imprint on my development as a musician and as a music educator. And I am the classic example of it takes a village, because he and several other directors in the area made sure that if they knew of something that might be a meaningful opportunity for my musical enrichment, that I knew about it, my family knew about it. And that led to Interlochen, and it led to Blue Lake, and it led to the Michigan Youth Arts Festival and the Michigan Youth Band in Ann Arbor. It was a really formative year, but it took a lot of people. There was no guarantee that there was going to be any level of success. So it was all hands on deck when it came to me.
So from high school, you went to the University of Michigan, where you played in H. Robert Reynolds ensembles and started a relationship really for you that continues to this day. I mean, there's so many times that your career paths have crossed and all that we're going to talk a little bit about here in a few minutes. But talk about the first time you met Bob Reynolds.
Gosh, that's almost hard to remember because the Michigan Music Educators Conference was in Ann Arbor, and they had this collage concert that was just a showstopper of a performance, and it involved the symphony band. And I remember, again, Mr. Clark making sure that you go to this conference with your parents, but let's be sure that we go to the collage concert. And I remembered seeing him conduct and the sound of that band in that hall. And wow, it was just smoking. But I think the first time I met him, and he wouldn't remember this, but I was in the Michigan Youth Band, and he conducted Psalm for Band by Vincent Persichetti. Don Schleicher was the regular conductor, so this was a high school audition honor band on Sunday nights, all school year long. And so Don had invited Professor Reynolds to come and guest conduct. And so Persichetti's Psalm for Band was my first experience with Bob. And I can remember when he stepped on the podium, there was just something about him that everybody knew, you bring your A game now or just pack up and go. And he wasn't mean. He wasn't intimidating. And here he was giving up his Sunday night with a bunch of high school kids. But there was just something about him that you knew. It was palpable, his commitment to the music and his determination to have a meaningful experience, and you did not want to disappoint.
Yeah. You mentioned the influence of Mr. Clark, your high school band director, and then when you went to college, and you may have just alluded to that a little bit, but thinking back, what was the difference about playing in a really good high school band and then playing in a really wonderful university band?
I think one of the big differences for me was when I got to college, my second semester of my freshman year, I placed in the tuba section of the Michigan Symphony Band. Now, I had no business being there, but it was apparent the level of individual responsibility was enormous. And you came to rehearsal not just knowing your music, but I can remember sitting next to a euphonium player named Luis Maldonado in symphony band rehearsal. It was Luis Maldonado and Ken Cresci. And Ken Cresci is at Oakland now, teaching just outside of Detroit. It was just a remarkable euphonium section. But Luis raised his hand in rehearsal as a doctoral student and asked a question about the second clarinet part from the euphonium section. And I was sitting there as a freshman thinking, I don't even know where the second clarinets are sitting, let alone what they're playing. And this guy in the back row, I mean, it was ear-opening for me.
So you made it through Michigan, you graduate, and then you go back and you teach in your hometown. And I understand you developed an incredible band program there. So how was it to go back home and become the band director?
It was an honor. I ended up being a colleague with Mr. Clark. Mr. Clark was at the school that I graduated from as a high schooler, and then I ended up teaching at the other school in town called Port Huron Northern. So having him as a colleague was a real treat. I had some of my former teachers who had transferred schools, so they were colleagues and they were very good to me. But I heard Gary Hill say on your podcast that his students were patient, and I understood exactly what he was saying. I was learning so much on a regular basis, but it was a real privilege to be able to give back to my community. I knew the system, I knew the community well. I had a principal that is is still to this day the best administrator I ever worked for. His name was Jim Goldsworthy, and he knew nothing about music, but he knew everything about supporting the teachers to do their job. If you weren't doing your job, he let you know. And if you were doing your job, he let you know. But I had great support in the administration, the parents, some of whom I'm still friends with to this day on Facebook or other ways of staying in touch. And the best part, as you know, is the students. I mean, my goodness, I don't know what I did to become so lucky to have those human beings as students, but it was, my gosh, it was an honor.
So what was the impetus for you to go back to Michigan, work on your master's degree, where you ended up eventually on the staff of the Michigan Marching Band, correct?
Yeah, so my licensure ran out. In Michigan, you had 5 years and then you had to renew it. And I thought, well, I'm just going to get a master's degree anyway. And you could do you could do 30 degrees of credit while you were teaching. But I thought, I really want to go and just wrap myself in another educational experience, having been a teacher and gotten that vantage point. I think you're a better student after you've taught. And so for me, it just turned out that I attended the conducting workshop in Ann Arbor, and Bob mentioned something, and I went back to school. My licensure ran out, and it was time to get some more credits. I took a leave of absence from my high school job because I just loved it. And when I was finishing my master's, the assistant director of bands position was open. And Bob had said to me, you should think about applying for this job. I thought, yeah, right. Okay. But I did, and was so very fortunate to work with him and Jim Tapia.
Yeah, I'm sure he was still your teacher, but you kind of moved from the role of being a student now to a colleague. What was that like?
Well, Bob made it easy for me. He is, as you know, as many people know, he is incredibly gracious, and he just treated me like a colleague and made me part of the team. And that's one of the lessons that I hope that I implement to this day is just being a part of the team and making sure everybody knows that their contribution is needed and wanted.
So from Michigan, you go to the University of Wisconsin, Stevens Point. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I got a call when I was in Ann Arbor from a friend of mine named Charles Young. And we had worked together at the All-State program at Interlochen in the summers. And Charles and I were at Michigan together for different degrees. And he was on the theory and composition faculty. And he called and said, we're looking for somebody for our director of bands position. Jim Arrowwood is retiring. And he said, do you know of any grad students there, anybody that we should be looking at? And I asked him to tell me about the job because I knew that two important people in my life, part of that village I was referring to earlier, had been the director of bands there. One was Don Schleicher and the other was Dennis Glocke. And when he got done describing the job, I thought, wait a second. I mean, Bob was retiring. Jim Tapia was going to leave to go to Syracuse and become the orchestra director. And I thought, maybe this is a time for me to look at this position. So I ended up at UW Stevens Point, and I taught there for 5 years.
So the Charles Young you talk about, is that the composer of Tempered Steel?
That is Charles Rochester Young.
Okay, that's what I thought. What a wonderful opportunity that was for you.
Oh, it was.
I heard you did such a great job at Stevens Point. Then that you got a call from Madison because you were stealing all their students. Is there any truth to that?
I don't know if that's true or not. But I did get a phone call from one of the faculty in Madison who asked if I would consider coming to Madison for a year of interim work because they were looking for an orchestra director. And so Jim Smith, who was the wind ensemble conductor, was going to do the orchestras, and they needed a wind ensemble conductor. So I came to Madison for an interim position, and Jim Smith got the orchestra job. And then that same year they did a search. So I applied for the position and moved to Madison permanently.
And you've been there how many years now?
13.
God, has it been 13 already?
Yeah, it has. It's hard to believe.
That time flies when you're having fun, doesn't it?
Sure does. It sure does.
So how did your days as a high school band director help shape your time as a university conductor? Anything that you brought with you or that you learned there that, made you more prepared to teach at the university level?
I mean, there are probably more things than we have time for here. But I would say one of the biggest things I learned, and I learned because I failed at it miserably when I was first teaching, was how to read a group, the group psychology and the group dynamics. When I was first teaching, I would be so obsessed with the intonation of two flute players that I think one time an entire 40-minute class period flew by and I was still tuning the flutes and it was time to pack up. But so I learned how to read a group because I could run a rehearsal into the ground like nobody else. And then you learn how to survive and you learn how to bring it back. Those are invaluable experiences. But from that, I really learned about reading body language and group dynamics and group psychology. And try as they might with their best efforts, it's really hard to learn that stuff from a book or from a class. But you've got to be in front of a group. And as well as I, if you're in front of an ensemble and you see the third chair trombone player scratch or yawn, you can be in front of 50 people and you notice that one thing. And I also think that the group psychology part has been a really strong carryover for me, how to keep students involved in the music making process and what the rehearsal is like from their vantage point.
Yeah. So what are those things that the conductor, besides that awareness of the group, needs to bring to the podium?
I think the best teachers and the best conductors bring their vulnerability. I mean, there is no way to hide. It's impossible to get on the podium and not expose everything about who you are. It is just impossible. And musicians at any age pick up on that. So it's important for musicians, it's important for conductors to have full knowledge of the score and musical decisions and rehearsal strategies and techniques and all of those things I would agree with. But I think at the core of it, for a really meaningful musical experience to happen, the conductor needs to be comfortable being uncomfortable, and you have to be okay being vulnerable. So I don't think we can ask our musicians to be vulnerable and to take risks if we're not willing to do the same.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great point.
I don't think it's any different in front of a 7th grade band or a university ensemble.
So in your ensemble, I'm sure you have a mixture of graduate students. You got performance majors, you got ed majors, you got all of those things. And each one of those groups really has a different set of needs that they're looking for. So how do you balance meeting the needs of all of those students in your ensembles?
I don't know if I do, but I know how I try. We do have all of those demographics that you just identified, and we have non-majors in all of the ensembles, and we have double majors at Wisconsin. So there are non-major clarinet players, and there's a non-major clarinet player in the wind ensemble, and there's a bassoonist who plays in Yo-Yo Ma's Silk Road ensemble. Wow. So you have that span and everything in between. And they're very, very bright people. So I think it's probably a lot like, well, first of all, I function under the impression or the assumption that everybody is here to have a meaningful experience with music. And our job is to connect the human soul and the human spirit to the process of making music, the interaction. So our first rehearsal typically is set up in duets. So the rehearsal hall isn't set up in the traditional, but then we start and we're playing and interacting with two people, and then we shift chairs and make it a trio and a quartet and a quintet and all those kind of things where they're listening around. And I try to use the term colleague because I want them to be thinking of each other as colleagues. And your colleagues are listening to you, and you are playing for your colleagues. You're not playing for me. We're not preparing for a product that's 4 weeks away. We are performing for each other right now. And I ask them whose music making right now has grabbed your attention. Who would you congratulate right now in that little exercise? And so they're listening around the room. I think what I try to do is what a team or a business leader does is you try to observe and learn as much about the students as you can, and you find where their strengths are. And everybody has meaningful skills to contribute to the process. And my job is to tap into those. I like to ask questions in rehearsal, and I like to let the silence ring until somebody's so uncomfortable that they'll speak up and say something. And then when they know it's safe and their perhaps most preposterous idea isn't going to get laughed out of the room, there's a collaboration. And I think people will strive to make a significant contribution to the process. So in some ways, it's just opening the door for them to share what they know or what their strengths are.
Yeah, you talk about that dead silence in those rehearsals. I had a colleague at Vandercook, the choir guy, who was just terrific. And we talked one time, and he said, I never say someone needs to have an answer to this question, because then they never feel responsible. He said, I always say, okay, he's talking to the group. He said, you need to have an answer to this question, which kind of puts them on the spot that they've got to formulate an answer. And he said, when I call on them, then I'm expecting them to answer. So, yeah.
The other thing I found in that is we're going to do this or play this section or this whatever phrase, and I would like you to have an idea about X. And at the end of this, I'm going to ask you to turn to your stand partner and just share what you think. And then I give them time to talk, and then we do it again. And then I share with your stand partner this, and share with the person on the other side about that. And it just starts to create these small safe zones. And then I ask if somebody be willing to share something. And so it starts to invite an openness, but it's a fascinating process to observe.
You mentioned earlier, having your radar up and noticing everything that goes in the room and how that impacted your pacing. You have a reputation, whether you realize it or not, that you connect with your students at an incredibly high level. And in addition to your great skills as a conductor and a teacher, I mean, you really work hard to make those students feel special. There's a couple of websites out there, and I did some research, and your students post about their teachers, and one after another kept talking about this. They kept bringing this same thing up. So is this something that you do special? Is it a part of your DNA? Anything in particular that you do that just makes you connect with your students?
I'm very honored to hear that. And I'm grateful for you sharing that. I think I simply try to see them as people. I mean, that's what they are. They're people, and there are people who need validation, and there are people who are completely comfortable in their skin, and there are people who are trying to become adults, and people who are trying to become more confident in their musical abilities. And I think now, perhaps more than ever, the people in the world need the vote of confidence from my generation that they've got this. And I'm honored by that. Frankly, quite moved. I don't know that I have an answer for that.
Okay. Well, but that's what I just want you to know. That's what your students say about you. And I think what a wonderful testimony to who you are and to what you do. And I think it's great. So let's change gears a minute. So like we all do, we hear about this hot new composer that's out there, and there's this hot new composition out there. We haven't heard it. We just kind of heard about it. So when you finally get the chance to listen to it or look at the score, What are the things that you look for that determines whether or not the piece is worthy of performing?
I struggle with that every time, like I think all my colleagues do, when they're looking at a piece for sixth grade band or eighth grade choir or university or whatnot. The first thing I try to do is, I'm always curious, where did this come from? So if I'm looking at the score someplace, even at a conference, if I'm at one of the booths and I open something up, I try to find the material. What is the material in here, and does it speak to my imagination? Can I see how this has been laid out as I thumb through it? Do I see recurring themes or development patterns? I look for structure. I look for form, development. I am big on development. I think sometimes just in society in general, we're stuck in the exposition. We're exploring this and exploring that, but really getting to the development of a skill or the development of a musical idea. But if through that process things start to speak to me, and it just looks like something I'd be interested in finding more out about this piece, then I'm interested in going back to it. So was it Oscar Wilde who said, as soon as a piece of art, as soon as you feel like you know a piece of art, it's dead to you. So I like the fact that a piece of music is always asking me questions or causing me to ask questions of it.
You've done a lot of all-state ensembles. And so when you go to an all-state, what's your philosophy of programming, and what do you want those students to experience?
The philosophy of programming is definitely geared towards the goal of the experience. And for me, the goal of the experience is that students have, in the course of that short amount of time, they have been transformed because of the music. Not because of me, but because of the music and the music making together. You know, it's the intangible that makes music music and not literature or art. It's the feeling that got us into music to begin with. And you walk into that scenario and you know everyone who is there considers it an honor to be there. And so do I. And they all want to play their best because they're collaborating with student musicians from around the state. So I just want them to have the same joy of the music making that I do. So that's always the goal. Just
Last question. Go ahead.
To have them involved in the process and to have them leave after the concert being different human beings than they were when they came in.
Yeah.
Because of the music.
Yeah.
And you know, those are funny things, Charlie. You know this as well as I do. It's like a blind date when you go into an all-state. You go into this all-state and you have no idea what's going to make this group, this entity click. You don't know what their interests are. You don't know what their humor is. You don't know what they're going to respond to. You don't know how vulnerable they're going to allow themselves to be. And at the end of that, you're expected to at least be engaged.
Right.
So you go into this blind date with the expectation of being engaged by the end of it. And the repertoire is definitely, it is the vehicle that can make or break it.
So last question.
Yeah.
Scott Teeple gets to have a conversation with Percy Granger. What would you ask him?
Well, Percy Granger, I feel like there was one time where Percy Granger and I were friends, and he didn't really know it. But when I was, you know how you read a book about somebody or their biography, and you just feel like they're in your world or you are in theirs. When I was in high school, one of the summers I spent in the All-State program at Interlochen as a tuba player was with Larry Radcliffe. That was an experience. We did in that band Canzona, Ye Banks and Braes, and the Hindemith Symphony in B flat. in 2 weeks, and it was intense. But Banks and Brays changed me forever because what he brought out in the music. So then I got a biography of Percy Grainger, and then I was talking to Mr. Clark back at home about Percy Grainger, and then I was just trying to read everything I could and listen to everything I could, which was harder in those days. You had to get cassettes and LPs, but my family was fortunate enough to go on a vacation out east. We were just going to drive around and go to the East Coast for a week or so. And they asked if there was any place I wanted to go. And I wanted to go to number 7 Cromwell Place in White Plains, New York. It was very specific. Do you want to go to the Statue of Liberty? No. Do you want to go to the Liberty Bell? No. Really where I would like to go. And my dad and I were out on a run, and we were trying to find number 7 Cromwell Place, and the lady at the hotel, it was a little cul-de-sac, if I remember correctly, off the beaten path. We knocked on the door, and Stuart Manville was living there. Stuart had married Ella Grainger after Percy died, and Stuart Manville had number 7 Cromwell Place in exactly the same condition it was when Percy had been there. So the wax cylinders were on the dining room table, and the harmonium was off in the room to the left. And he took us downstairs and into the fireproof rooms that Grainger had built in the basement because he was concerned about losing music and Ella's paintings due to the war. And there were boxes of some of Grainger's pieces, and I can remember seeing Colonial Song just stuffed on a shelf there, and it was like seeing the Holy Grail. It just kind of took my breath away. So I think I could probably sit down and ask Grainger gobs and gobs of questions. I could probably ask him what he had for lunch and just hang on every word. But he had a very formative influence on my early music making.
That's wonderful. That's a great story. Scott Teeple, you have a very formidable influence on a lot of people's music making. And it's been so much fun to have the opportunity to sit down and chat with you for the podcast. And I really appreciate your time. And I can't wait till the next time I get a chance to see you and be able to say thank you in person. So be well. God bless.
You know, Charlie, one of the silver linings in this epidemic is it has brought people together. And I'm grateful for what you're doing to bring us together too. So it is an honor. Thanks.
As you heard in the conversation, Scott Teeple is very aware of people and the important role teachers have in our students' development as musicians and also as humans. Scott's comment about now, perhaps more than ever, the people in the world need the vote of confidence from my generation that they got this, is one that will resonate with me a long time. It so clearly illustrates the importance of being a role model and the impact we have on our students' lives. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast, and I hope that you'll tell your friends and colleagues about Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and Friends. Next week, our guests will include Bruce Moss, Director of Bands at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and conductor of the Wheaton Municipal Band in Wheaton, Illinois. And we'll also have a couple of special guests that you'll not want to miss. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and Friends. If you would like to send a question to Charlie or have a comment, please send an email to bandtalkcharlie@gmail.com. We hope you will let your colleagues, students, and friends know about Band Talk with Charlie Mangini and Friends. Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to being with you again soon.